What if the biggest political argument in America right now isn't about socialism? What if it's about what we mean by that word? Because in 2026, candidates who identify as democratic socialists, they're winning elections. Republicans are warning that socialism, even communism, is moving into the Democratic Party. Democrats and progressives are warning that fascism and authoritarianism are moving into the Republican Party. And somewhere in the middle, millions of Americans are trying to figure out what's actually true. Is socialism taking over America? Are Democrats becoming communist? Are Republicans becoming fascist? Has socialism ever worked? Is Finland socialist? And perhaps the biggest question of all, are we debating political ideas or are we just throwing historical insults at people we don't like? Welcome to Holy Sorta, where we question everything, grow intentionally, and try to look at complicated issues from more than one perspective. Because typically the truth isn't just a sticker on a bumper. Let's start with what's actually happening, because this isn't just some theoretical debate anymore. It's happening at the ballot box. In 2026, candidates associated with the Democratic Socialist movement have been winning Democratic primaries in several parts of the country. And one of the biggest surprises was when Florida State Representative Angie Nixon, who identifies with the Democratic Socialist movement, defeated former national security official Alex Vindman in the Democratic primary for U.S. Senate down there in Florida. It was an upset victory. Vindman had dramatically outraised her at about 16 million to a little under 1 million. Nixon, she won anyway. She now faces Republican Senator Ashley Moody in November. Now, this didn't happen in New York City or San Francisco, it happened in Florida. Nixon's campaign emphasized issues including economic justice, health care, and affordability. But here's something important. After her victory, Nixon herself said, "It's not about labels." She argued that her campaign was about people's needs rather than simply being a socialist or a progressive campaign. And Axios reported another interesting detail. The Democratic Socialists of America did not recognize or endorse Nixon's campaign, and apparently they did not expect her to win. So even the label itself gets complicated, but the broader movement is real. Democratic Socialist candidates have made significant gains in Democratic primaries around the country. And New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani has become one of the most visible faces of the movement. The Financial Times recently reported that the Democratic Socialists of America have grown dramatically over the last decade, reflecting growing interest among younger Americans on issues like healthcare, housing, wages, and economic inequality. So, yes, something is changing. But now comes the other side. Republicans, they're paying attention, and they're not exactly being subtle about how they're describing the movement. Republican leaders and candidates increasingly are using words like socialist, Marxist, communist. President Trump has repeatedly warned about what he describes as a communist threat inside the Democratic Party. VP J.D. Vance has also warned about communism as a growing political force, and House Speaker Mike Johnson attacked Democratic Rep. Tom Suozzi as part of what he called the Marxist left. The Republican argument is essentially this: Democratic Socialists are gaining influence, and the Democratic Socialists of America is growing. Some candidates openly identify as Democratic Socialists, and therefore the Democratic Party is moving toward socialism and perhaps even communism. That argument deserves to be examined. But there's another side, because Democrats and progressive activists have their own vocabulary for Republicans. Trump and MAGA Republicans have frequently been described as fascists, Nazis, authoritarians, and sometimes as threats to democracy itself, to our republic, to our representative democracy. This isn't imaginary. The rhetoric is very real. A recent analysis in the Los Angeles Times even noted the increasingly familiar pattern. The right calls the left communist, while the left calls the right fascist. And there are plenty of examples. You've all seen them. In the U.S. House this summer, a Democratic member literally described the Republican Party as a party of fascists. So let's stop right there because we've got something fascinating happening in American politics. The right says, look out, communism, and the left says, look out, fascism. Both sides are reaching into history and pulling out some of the darkest words they can find. Communism evokes the Soviet Union, Stalin, Mao, political repression, centralized power, and the suppression of individual liberties. Fascism evokes Mussolini, Hitler, Nazi Germany, dictatorships, ultranationalism, political repression, and the destruction of democratic institutions. These aren't casual words, they're serious historical terms. And that's exactly why we should be careful with them. Because if we call every progressive policy communism and every conservative policy fascism, eventually the words stop meaning anything. And when words lose their meaning, we lose the ability to have a serious political conversation. So let's establish today's Holy Sorta rule, we'll call it. Don't just give me the label, give me the evidence. If we're going to call somebody a communist, show me the communist policy. If we're going to call somebody fascist, show me the fascist behavior. If we're going to call somebody a socialist, define what kind. And if we're going to call somebody a threat to democracy, tell me exactly what they're doing, because political labels are easy. Critical thinking is much harder. And that's where this conversation begins. This is a propaganda alert, and it's where we need to slow down a minute, because both sides are doing something that should make us very uncomfortable as Americans. They are taking legitimate political concerns and sometimes turning them into exaggerated historical comparisons. Let's start with the right. When Republicans call democratic-socialist communists, there is a legitimate reason to examine the ideological differences between socialism, democratic societies, and communism. There are democratic socialist organizations that advocate substantial changes to the American economy, its structure, including greater public ownership of certain industries. There are candidates who openly identify with democratic socialism. And there are legitimate questions about whether some of those proposals would expand government power too far or eliminate it too much altogether, like get rid of the army, the police. Those are fair questions, but here's the problem. Democratic socialism is not automatically communism. And a person supporting universal health care, for example, higher taxes, stronger unions, or public housing doesn't automatically become a communist. That's historically and politically too simplistic. The current debate demonstrates exactly why definitions matter. For example, reporting on the 2026 Democratic primary season has distinguished Democratic Socialist candidates from the Communist Party tradition and noted that the two aren't interchangeable. There's been coverage about that in the media. Now let's flip the camera around. When Democrats call Republicans fascists or Nazis, there can also be legitimate reasons to examine authoritarian behavior. Threats to democratic institutions should be taken seriously. Political violence should also be taken very seriously. Attempts to undermine elections should also be taken very, very seriously, and the abuse of government power is a very serious matter. They're legitimate questions, but being conservative isn't being fascist. Supporting Trump is not automatically Nazism. Wanting strong borders isn't fascism. Wanting lower taxes A strong military wanting social policies is not fascism when they're traditional social policies. Again, the label is not the evidence. So here's the Holy Sorta propaganda alert. When a politician tells you they are communists, stop and ask, what exactly do they advocate? And when someone tells you they're a bunch of fascists, stop and ask, what exactly have they done? Then ask one more question. Would I believe this claim if it were being made about my political side? That's the uncomfortable question because propaganda is not always completely false. Sometimes propaganda starts with a legitimate fact and then stretches it until it becomes something much, much bigger. That's how political manipulation works. A candidate really might be a socialist, but that doesn't necessarily make them a communist. A politician really might engage in authoritarian behavior, but that's not automatically making them a fascist. And here's an even bigger problem. Once you convince people that the other side is literally Hitler or literally Stalin, you've made compromise nearly impossible. Because why would you compromise with Hitler or Stalin? Why would you negotiate with those types? You wouldn't. And that's precisely why these labels are politically powerful and a pretty bad idea. They turn political opponents into existential enemies. Genesis teaches that human beings are created in the image of God. That means human dignity doesn't come from government. It doesn't come from wealth or productivity or political usefulness. Human dignity existed before government. The Declaration of Independence makes a similar point. Human beings possess rights that government does not simply invent. But Scripture also repeatedly tells us to care for people who are vulnerable: widows, orphans, strangers, the poor, people who are hurting. Jesus says, love your neighbor. Micah says, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And the early Christian community shared generously so that people among them did not lack basic necessities. So here's where Christians sometimes get themselves into trouble. They assume capitalism equals Christianity or socialism equals Christianity. Neither statement is supported by Scripture. Now, let's step outside the political shouting match because here's where things get really interesting. The original socialism research makes an important distinction. Countries such as Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway are generally not socialist economies. They're market economies with extensive social democratic institutions. They have private businesses, private property, entrepreneurship, competition, and markets. But they also have substantial public services and social protections. And many of these countries consistently rank near the top of international life satisfaction measurements. Researchers associate higher life satisfaction with things like social trust, low corruption, economic security, social support, healthcare access, work-life balance, and confidence in public institutions. Now, does that prove social democracy is superior? No, I don't think so. Happiness rankings don't measure ultimate human flourishing. They measure life satisfaction. But that raises an interesting question. If people in different societies consistently report different levels of security and satisfaction, shouldn't we at least investigate this and ask why? That's not surrender, that's just curiosity. And curiosity is one of the most important tools we have, especially in a capitalist society. But at the same time, America does many things remarkably well, like innovation, entrepreneurship, technology, venture capital, scientific research, pharmaceutical development, starting businesses, and creating entirely new industries like AI. The United States has also generated enormous wealth, and the American model places greater emphasis on individual choice, entrepreneurship, lower taxes, and economic opportunity. Social democratic systems generally place greater emphasis on economic security, universal services, lower inequality, and social protections. But those systems generally require higher taxes, greater government involvement, and different economic trade offs. So perhaps the real question isn't capitalism or socialism. Maybe it's how much freedom markets should have, and how much responsibility should government assume for economic security. That's a much more interesting question and a much more difficult one. So let's answer the original question. Has socialism ever worked? We hear that a lot. Well, it depends on what we mean. If by socialism we mean a centrally planned economy where government owns or controls most productive assets, history gives us plenty of reasons to be skeptics. So when someone says socialism has never worked, the Holy Sorta response should be which socialism? And when someone says Finland proves socialism does work, the response should be is Finland actually socialist? That's why definitions matter. Now, let's bring this back to America, because another popular argument says the founders would never have supported anything resembling social democracy. Maybe, but let's be precise. The Constitution does not actually establish capitalism as America's official economic system. It doesn't say government shall provide private health care. It doesn't say government shall provide universal health care. It doesn't say taxes shall be low. It doesn't say taxes shall be high. The founders had lived under concentrated authority, a king and empire, so they designed a system that assumed something profoundly realistic. Human beings are imperfect. James Madison understood this because if humans were angels, government really wouldn't be necessary. But humans are not angels, neither are politicians, corporations, or churches, even activists, even you or me. None of us are perfect, as we all know quite well. The Constitution is not based on the assumption that people are perfect. It's based on the assumption that power must be restrained. So divide it, limit it, balance it, and check it. Now here's where our conversation goes a little deeper. The market-oriented tradition emphasizes liberty, private property, entrepreneurship, personal responsibility, voluntary charity, and economic opportunity. And there are legitimate reasons to value those things. Economic freedom can produce innovation, entrepreneurship, opportunity. Private property can encourage responsibility, and voluntary generosity can be very powerful. But there's another perspective. What good is legal freedom if a person has no practical ability to exercise it? What good is educational opportunity if quality education is inaccessible? What good is economic freedom if a family is destroyed financially by an illness? Supporters of social democracy argue that government can reduce some of these barriers through healthcare, education, unemployment insurance, pensions, and worker protections. The socialism document describes this as a debate between negative liberty, in other words, freedom from government interference, and positive liberty, having the practical means to exercise one's choices. And here's the fascinating part. Both sides, they can point to legitimate American and biblical principles. The market-oriented tradition says liberty, responsibility, limited government, and opportunity. The social democratic tradition says justice, shared responsibility, economic security, protection of the vulnerable. Those aren't necessarily evil values. The challenge is determining where is the line. Too little government can leave vulnerable people without meaningful opportunity, and too much government can concentrate power and reduce liberty and weaken personal responsibility. And maybe that's the real debate. Here's the Holy Sorta 5-point reality check. First, define the words. Before arguing about socialism, define socialism. Before calling someone a communist, find out whether they actually advocate communism. Before calling someone a fascist, define fascism because words matter. 2. Question your own side. So if you're conservative, don't automatically believe every claim that says socialism equals communism. And if you're progressive, don't automatically believe every claim that says Trump equals Hitler. Question your own side. That's harder, but that's also critical thinking. Number 3, look at results, not just intentions. A policy can have compassionate intentions and produce unintended consequences. Policy can increase economic efficiency and still leave people behind. Ask, does it work? And who pays? And who benefits? What are the unintended consequences and can it survive? Number 4, defend principles, not political teams. If you believe in free speech, defend it when someone you hate is speaking. If you believe in religious liberty, defend it when someone else's religion benefits. If you believe government should be limited, defend that principle when your own party controls government. And if you believe government should do more, ask yourself, would I still support that power if the other party controlled it? That's the test. Number 5, remember what government can't do. Government can provide services. It can regulate, it can tax. Unfortunately, it can redistribute, build, and it can protect. But government cannot manufacture faith, character, love, family, purpose, community, or virtue. Can't manufacture that. Those require people. That's why personal responsibility still matters. So, are socialists taking over America? Something's definitely happening. The Democratic-Socialist of America and affiliated candidates have clearly gained some influence. Angie Nixon's Florida victory is significant. Zoran Mondami's rise to fame is also significant. Other progressive primary victories are also significant. But one or two election cycles don't prove that America has become socialist. Certainly not. And they certainly don't prove America has become communist. However, at the same time, Republicans are right to ask serious questions about the economic philosophy of candidates who self-identify as democratic socialists. What would they nationalize? How much government control? How would they pay for their programs? What happens to private enterprise and incentives and government responsibility? And what if they get it wrong? Those are all legitimate questions, but Democrats are also right to ask serious questions about government power. What happens when executive power becomes too concentrated? What happens when political institutions are weakened? What happens when political violence becomes normalized? What happens when leaders attack democratic institutions? Those are legitimate questions also, and that's the point. Both sides have legitimate questions, but neither side gets a free pass. The Republican who calls every Democrat communist needs to define communism. The Democrat who calls every Republican a fascist needs to define fascism. The progressive who says capitalism is inherently evil needs to explain the extraordinary prosperity and innovation capitalism has produced. The conservative who says government programs never work needs to explain why programs like Social Security, Medicare, and public education remain deeply embedded in American life. And the Christian who says this economic system is biblical needs to show us where Scripture actually says that. Because here's what I do think the Bible tells us: human beings have dignity, power needs accountability, justice matters, and mercy matters. Freedom also matters, and responsibility, personal responsibility, definitely matters, as well as caring for our neighbors. The American constitutional tradition adds another principle: no one should have unlimited power. Not government, corporations, political parties, presidents, billionaires, trillionaires, activists, churches, not nobody. And perhaps that's where the socialism debate gets more interesting. Maybe the central question isn't capitalism or socialism, Maybe it's what kind of society best protects human dignity while also preserving freedom, responsibility, and opportunity. What policies encourage prosperity without abandoning the vulnerable? Which policies provide security without creating dependency? Which policies protect individual freedom without ignoring community responsibility? And which policies restrain government without making government incapable of governing? These are not easy questions, but they're better questions. And maybe that's what the American experiment was intended and designed to do. Not answer every question forever, but create a constitutional system where free people could continue wrestling with these questions. So here's today's Holy Sorta takeaway. Don't let a political label do your thinking for you. When somebody says socialist, ask what do they actually believe? When somebody says communist, ask what policies are they proposing? When somebody says fascist, ask what behavior are you describing? And when somebody says that's what the other side believes, ask is it really? And when somebody tells you that your political team is always right, that's probably the moment when you should become the most skeptical, because faith without thought can become blindness. Politics without conscience can become power without purpose, and ideology without humility can become its own kind of religion. So I'd question everything, grow intentionally, because truth still rocks and light still leads, but sometimes faith ain't pretty. And neither are politics. I'm Dr. Hayes. Thanks for watching. Take care and be good.
A nation founded on faith. Now we're divided. We're not as holy as we used to be, but truth still rocks. Light still leads. This is Holy Sorta.